The history of the United States. From sea to shining sea stretches a nation that didn't exist 250 years ago yet has shaped the modern world profoundly. The United States of America, a bold experiment in democracy, a land of immigrants and indigenous peoples, of towering ideals and profound contradictions, of innovation and inequality, of freedom proclaimed and freedom denied. This is the story of how a collection of British colonies became a superpower, how enslaved people fought for liberty in a land that proclaimed all men created equal, how waves of immigrants transformed a continent, and how a nation born in revolution continues to struggle with the meaning of its founding principles. Our journey begins not with Europeans, but with the peoples who called this land home for thousands of years before any ship arrived from across the ocean. Ancient roots and colonial foundations. Indigenous civilizations, 12,000 BCE, 1492 CE. Long before the name America existed, diverse civilizations flourished across the continent. Paleo-Indians arrived perhaps 15,000 years ago, crossing from Asia during the Ice Age. By 1492, millions of people lived in what would become the United States. Estimates range from 5 to 15 million, speaking hundreds of languages and living in societies as varied as the landscape itself. In the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde and complex settlements at Chaco Canyon. The Mississippian culture created Cahokia near modern St. Louis, a city of perhaps 20,000 people, larger than London at the time, with massive earthwork mounds and sophisticated trade networks spanning the continent. In the northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy united 5 nations under a great law of peace, creating a democratic system that would later influence America's founders. On the Great Plains, nomadic peoples followed buffalo herds. In the Pacific Northwest, societies built on salmon fishing developed rich artistic traditions. These weren't primitive peoples awaiting civilization. They were complex societies with agriculture, architecture, governance, and culture. Then, in 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean, and everything changed. European contact and colonization, 1492 to 1750. European contact brought catastrophe for indigenous peoples. Diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, killed up to 90% of Native Americans who had no immunity. Entire nations vanished. Survivors faced warfare, displacement, and cultural destruction as European colonies expanded. Spain dominated the southeast and southwest. England established colonies along the Atlantic coast, Virginia in 1607, Plymouth in 1620, eventually 13 colonies stretching from Massachusetts to Georgia. France controlled the Mississippi Valley and Canada. The Dutch briefly held New York. These weren't empty lands. They were taken through warfare, treaties often broken, and the devastating impact of disease. The colonies developed distinct characters. New England's Puritans sought religious freedom while imposing religious conformity. The middle colonies were more diverse and tolerant. Southern colonies built economies on tobacco and rice cultivated by enslaved Africans. Slavery became central to American development. The first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619. By 1750, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies, though concentrated in the South. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic in horrific conditions. Slavery's wealth built much of colonial America, and its legacy would haunt the nation. The Road to Revolution, 1750 to 1776. By the mid-18th century, the 13 colonies were prosperous but increasingly chafed under British rule. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, left Britain deeply in debt and seeking to tax colonies to pay for their defense. Colonists, used to self-governance, resisted. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry. The Stamp Act, Tea Act, and other taxes sparked protests. In 1770, British soldiers killed 5 colonists in the Boston Massacre. In 1773, colonists dumped British tea into Boston Harbor. Britain cracked down, closing the port and imposing military rule. In 1775, fighting erupted at Lexington and Concord. The American Revolution had begun. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress declared independence, proclaiming truth self-evident, that all men are created equal with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The irony was stark. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote these words, enslaved over 600 people in his lifetime. American freedom was built on contradictions that would take centuries to resolve. Revolution, expansion, and division, 8 to 4 p.m. The Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783. The Revolutionary War pitted colonial militia and Continental Army against the world's most powerful military. Britain had professional soldiers, the world's best navy, and vast resources. America had determination, knowledge of terrain, and eventually, French support. George Washington held the army together through terrible winters, including Valley Forge, where soldiers froze and starved. In 1781, French naval support trapped British forces at Yorktown. British General Cornwallis surrendered. Britain recognized American independence in 1783. The United States had won its freedom. Now it had to figure out how to govern itself. Creating a nation, 1783 to 1800. The first attempt at government, the Articles of Confederation, proved too weak. In 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia to write a new constitution. The result was revolutionary, a republic with separation of powers, checks and balances, and written guarantees of rights. Power would come from we the people, not kings or aristocracy. The Constitution was a compromise. Small states got equal representation in the Senate. Large states got proportional representation in the House. Southern states got to count enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes while denying them all rights, a moral obscenity baked into the founding document. George Washington became the first president in 1789. His peaceful transfer of power after 2 terms established crucial precedent. The nation's capital moved to Washington, D.C., a new city built, ironically, largely by enslaved laborers. Westward expansion and manifest destiny, 1800 to 1850. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the nation's size. President Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark to explore the new territory. Their expedition opened the West to American expansion. Manifest destiny, the belief that America was destined to span the continent, drove relentless westward movement. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, forcing southeastern tribes westward on the Trail of Tears, a death march killing thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, and others. Texas joined the Union in 1845. War with Mexico, 1846 to 1848, added California and the Southwest. The California Gold Rush of 1849 brought hundreds of thousands west. By 1850, America stretched from Atlantic to Pacific. But expansion raised a critical question: would new territories permit slavery? The crisis of slavery, 1820 to 1860. Slavery divided America. The North industrialized, building factories and cities with wage labor and immigrant workers. The South remained agricultural, its cotton economy dependent on enslaved labor. Cotton was king, driving both southern wealth and northern textile mills. Enslaved people resisted constantly, through work slowdowns, running away, and occasional revolts. The Underground Railroad helped thousands escape to freedom. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave who became a powerful orator, and Harriet Tubman, who led dozens to freedom, fought slavery courageously. White abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and John Brown joined the cause. Congress tried to manage slavery's expansion through compromises: the Missouri Compromise, 1820, the Compromise of 1850, but each deal merely delayed crisis. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854, led to violence as pro- and anti-slavery forces fought for control of Kansas. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, who opposed slavery's expansion, was elected president. Southern states seceded, forming the Confederate States of America. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. The Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The Civil War was America's bloodiest conflict, over 600,000 dead, more than all other American wars combined. The North had more people, more industry, and more resources. The South had better generals initially, passionate commitment, and defensive advantage. Early battles favored the South. But in 1863, Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg turned the tide. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation declared enslaved people in rebel states free, transforming the war into a fight against slavery itself. Black soldiers, nearly 200,000, joined Union forces, fighting for their own freedom and their people's future. General William Sherman's march through Georgia devastated the South. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The war was over. Slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment. But 5 days later, actor John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Lincoln. The great emancipator was dead, and the difficult work of Reconstruction was beginning. Industrialization, empire, and world wars. Reconstruction and Jim Crow, 1865 to 1900. Reconstruction attempted to integrate formerly enslaved people into American society. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship, the 15th granted voting rights. Black Americans voted, held office, and built schools and churches. But Reconstruction ended in 1877 through political compromise. Federal troops withdrew from the South. Southern whites reimposed control through violence and Jim Crow laws, segregating public facilities, disenfranchising black voters through literacy tests and poll taxes, and enforcing white supremacy through lynching and terror. The Ku Klux Klan murdered thousands. Separate and unequal became the law of the land. The Gilded Age and Industrial Revolution, 1870 to 1900. While the South struggled, the North industrialized rapidly. Railroads crossed the continent. Steel, oil, and banking created vast fortunes. Industrialists like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan accumulated wealth unimaginable to previous generations. This was the Gilded Age, glittering surface hiding social problems. Workers labored in dangerous conditions for low wages. Child labor was common. Cities grew chaotically. Immigrants from Europe, Irish, Italian, Eastern European Jews, others, crowded into tenements, providing cheap labor. Labor unions organized for better conditions. Strikes often turned violent. At Haymarket in Chicago, 1886, a bombing killed police. At Homestead, 1892, and Pullman, 1894, federal troops crushed strikes. The labor movement grew despite brutal suppression. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, who opposed slavery's expansion, was elected president. Southern states seceded, forming the Confederate States of America. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. The Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The Civil War was America's bloodiest conflict, over 600,000 dead, more than all other American wars combined. The North had more people, more industry, and more resources. The South had better generals initially, passionate commitment, and defensive advantage. Early battles favored the South. But in 1863, Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg turned the tide. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation declared enslaved people in rebel states free, transforming the war into a fight against slavery itself. Black soldiers, nearly 200,000, joined Union forces, fighting for their own freedom and their people's future. General William Sherman's march through Georgia devastated the South. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The war was over. Slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment. But 5 days later, actor John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Lincoln. The great emancipator was dead, and the difficult work of Reconstruction was beginning. Industrialization, empire, and world wars. Reconstruction and Jim Crow, 1865 to 1900. Reconstruction attempted to integrate formerly enslaved people into American society. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship, the 15th granted voting rights. Black Americans voted, held office, and built schools and churches. But Reconstruction ended in 1877 through political compromise. Federal troops withdrew from the South. Southern whites reimposed control through violence and Jim Crow laws, segregating public facilities, disenfranchising black voters through literacy tests and poll taxes, and enforcing white supremacy through lynching and terror. The Ku Klux Klan murdered thousands. Separate and unequal became the law of the land. The Gilded Age and Industrial Revolution, 1870 to 1900. While the South struggled, the North industrialized rapidly. Railroads crossed the continent. Steel, oil, and banking created vast fortunes. Industrialists like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan accumulated wealth unimaginable to previous generations. This was the Gilded Age, glittering surface hiding social problems. Workers labored in dangerous conditions for low wages. Child labor was common. Cities grew chaotically. Immigrants from Europe, Irish, Italian, Eastern European Jews, others, crowded into tenements, providing cheap labor. Labor unions organized for better conditions. Strikes often turned violent. At Haymarket in Chicago, 1886, a bombing killed police. At Homestead, 1892, and Pullman, 1894, federal troops crushed strikes. The labor movement grew despite brutal suppression. World War II, 1939 to 1945. When World War II began in 1939, America again stayed neutral. But after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, America entered the war. Over 16 million Americans served. The war effort mobilized the entire nation. Women worked in factories. Scientists developed the atomic bomb. America became the arsenal of democracy, producing weapons, vehicles, and supplies that supplied Allied forces. Victory came at enormous cost, over 400,000 Americans dead. But America emerged as a superpower, its economy booming, its military unmatched except by the Soviet Union. The United Nations was founded, and the atomic age had begun, with all its promise and peril. Act 4, Cold War, Civil Rights, and Modern America, 24:00-28:30, The Cold War, 1945 to 1991. America and the Soviet Union, wartime allies, became Cold War adversaries. The Iron Curtain divided Europe. Nuclear weapons threatened mutual destruction. America fought communism globally through containment policy, NATO alliance, and military interventions. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, ended in stalemate. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, divided America, killed over 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese, and ended in American withdrawal and communist victory. The Civil Rights Movement, 1950s to 1960s. Black Americans had fought in World War II for freedom abroad while facing discrimination at home. After the war, they demanded equality. In 1954, Brown v. Board of Education outlawed school segregation. In 1955, Rosa Parks's refusal to give up her bus seat sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. The civil rights movement was accelerating. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led nonviolent resistance, sit-ins, freedom rides, marches. In 1963, he delivered his I Have a Dream speech in Washington. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act outlawed discrimination. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act protected voting rights. Progress came through sacrifice, activists beaten, arrested, murdered. But laws changed, and slowly, so did society, though racial inequality persisted. Social upheaval, 1960s to 1970s. The 1960s brought social revolution. The women's movement fought for equality. The counterculture challenged traditional values. Opposition to the Vietnam War grew. In 1968, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were assassinated. Cities burned in riots. America seemed to be tearing itself apart. The 1970s brought disillusionment. Watergate scandal forced President Nixon's resignation. Economic stagnation ended post-war prosperity. America's global dominance was questioned. Reagan to 9/11, 1980 to 2001, Ronald Reagan's presidency, 1981 to 1989, brought conservative resurgence, tax cuts, deregulation, military buildup. The Cold War ended with the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. America stood alone as the world's superpower. The 1990s brought prosperity and globalization. The Internet transformed communication and commerce. But inequality grew. Manufacturing jobs disappeared. The benefits of growth went disproportionately to the wealthy. 21st century challenges, 2001 present. On September 11, 2001, terrorists attacked the World Trade Center and Pentagon, killing nearly 3,000 people. America responded with a war on terror, invading Afghanistan and Iraq, expanding surveillance, and dramatically increasing military spending. The 2008 financial crisis devastated the economy. Banks collapsed. Millions lost homes and jobs. The government bailed out major institutions, sparking anger across the political spectrum. Barack Obama's election in 2008 as America's first black president represented historic progress. But political polarization intensified. The Tea Party emerged on the right. Later, progressive movements arose on the left. Donald Trump's 2016 election defied expectations, revealing deep divisions over immigration, trade, race, and America's role in the world. His presidency was turbulent and divisive. COVID-19 pandemic killed over 1 million Americans, exposing healthcare and inequality gaps. Joe Biden's 2020 election was contested by Trump, culminating in the January 6, 2021, Capitol attack, the first time the peaceful transfer of power was violently challenged since the Civil War. Act V. Ending. America's ongoing experiment, the American identity. Narrator. What is America? It's a nation of immigrants. Except for Native Americans, everyone came from elsewhere. E pluribus unum, out of many, one, expresses the ideal, though achieving unity from diversity remains challenging. America's founding ideals, liberty, equality, democracy, were proclaimed universally but applied selectively. Women couldn't vote until 1920. Segregation was legal until the 1960s. Yet these ideals, however imperfectly realized, inspired movements for justice. Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, Martin Luther King Jr. all appealed to America's stated principles to demand their fulfillment. American influence. American influence is undeniable. The dollar dominates global finance. American military bases span the world. American culture, movies, music, technology, shapes global tastes. English is the global language largely due to American power. American innovation drives technology. Silicon Valley companies dominate the Internet. American universities attract students worldwide. American ideals of democracy and individual rights, however imperfectly practiced, influenced liberation movements globally. But American power has also caused harm, supporting dictators, waging controversial wars, pursuing economic policies enriching America at others' expense. The legacy is mixed. Challenges ahead. America faces profound challenges. Political polarization threatens democratic norms. Economic inequality approaches Gilded Age levels. Racial justice remains unfinished business. Climate change requires action at odds with powerful interests. Healthcare costs burden families. Infrastructure crumbles. Gun violence kills tens of thousands annually. Yet America has overcome crises before: civil war, depression, world wars, social upheaval. The question is whether Americans can summon the collective will to address present challenges. Closing. From indigenous civilizations to colonial outpost to global superpower, from slavery to civil rights, from isolationism to interventionism, America's story is one of constant transformation. It's a story of high ideals and terrible hypocrisies, of innovation and exploitation, of welcoming immigrants and excluding others, of proclaiming freedom while denying it. The American experiment continues, imperfect, striving, contentious. Can a diverse nation govern itself democratically? Can it live up to its founding ideals? Can it balance liberty and equality, individual rights and collective responsibility, national interest and global citizenship? These questions have no final answers. Each generation must answer them anew. That's the nature of democracy, not a destination but a journey, requiring constant vigilance, struggle, and recommitment to principles that, however imperfectly realized, still inspire hope that, as the founders wrote, we can form a more perfect union. This is America, land of contradictions and possibilities, of dreams deferred and dreams achieved, forever becoming, never quite arrived. Subscribe to Timelines of Nations for weekly videos exploring the ancient to modern history of countries around the world.